Good day from Washington, D.C., and on behalf of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, welcome back to the fifth webinar in our six-part series on artificial intelligence strategy in the security domain. Once again, I am Dr. Nate Allen, Associate Professor of Security Studies here at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. I lead our work on cyber and emerging technology issues, and I will be moderating today's discussion. This webinar is entitled Artificial Intelligence Risks for the Security Sector. In this session, we're going to discuss the risks artificial intelligence poses to security sector actors and talk about ways in which to mitigate them. And before we begin today, it is my honor to turn things over to Ms. Amanda Dory and welcome her back. She has just resumed her duties as the director of the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Amanda, over to you for a few words of welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen, Nate, and to all of the others who are online today. Good day, and bonjour, bon dia, assalamu alaikum, jambo. I could continue, but you get the idea. We are very delighted to continue the series, and I personally am to join in mid-stride. I'm very pleased to greet you today from the Africa Center here on the campus of the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And as Nate mentioned, for those who I have not yet met, my name is Amanda Dory, and it's my honor to serve as the director of the Africa Center, returning after a year's absence. And I'm very pleased to greet so many alumni as well as new attendees who are actively engaged in this conversation in service of tackling internal and cross-border security challenges of all kinds. I think many already know, but if there are any new participants today, the Africa Center was chartered by the U.S. Congress 25 years ago now to conduct academic programs and research. And we're working towards a vision in collaboration with all of you of security for all Africans that's buttressed by effective institutions that are accountable to their citizens. And the topic we have today is really on the cutting edge. AI is already reshaping virtually every sector we can think of, from education to healthcare, business, and of course, the security sphere. So I look forward to hearing from our expert panelists today to help open our imaginations and consider the risks that accompany the amazing opportunities that are presented by AI. So with that, let me turn back over to Dr. Nate Allen to lead us in our conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and again, welcome back. We're delighted to have you with us, and thanks for that great introduction. So over the past month, we have delved deep into the implications of artificial intelligence for security sector actors across Africa. We've discussed the implications of different types of AI, from narrow artificial intelligence-driven image and pattern recognition systems, some of which have been used for decades, to more advanced generative AI and soon agentic AI systems currently in development that are in the process or who will soon be kind of widely deployed. We've talked about how criminal organizations are exploiting artificial intelligence-enabled deepfakes to engage in ever more targeted forms of fraud, to innovative strategies terrorist groups are using to evade AI-enabled content detection moderation. We've discussed the kinds of considerations that you ought to think about in incorporating artificial intelligence into strategy and policy in the security sector. And in our last session, I hope you came away with a good understanding of how militaries and security forces are currently employing AI around the world for applications such as cybersecurity, in the information domain, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, decision support, and targeting, and military logistics. As with any novel technology, the increasing adoption of AI also carries risks. And I think the risks from AI are particularly vast given the vast amount of use cases and AI's transformative potential. They range from the ability of artificial intelligence to potentially democratize the manufacture of advanced bioweapons using the same AI-driven technology that is being used to find novel drug therapies, as well as more technical concerns that we've talked about already, such as how poorly trained data might lead AI to misidentify targets by, for example, identifying a passenger with a street sign standing behind it as a person in a vehicle. And specifically, we have two objectives for today. To outline a typology of risks for the security sector actor stemming from technical issues in artificial intelligence, such as bias, poorly trained data, as well as legal risks, looking at things like questions concerning autonomy or violations of international humanitarian law. And then we're also going to discuss how these risks might affect the employment of AI systems across the continent. And here to help us today to discuss these risks, we have two highly distinguished experts. Dr. Lauren Sanders is a senior research fellow with the TC Beirne School of Law at the University of Queensland in Australia. Her research focuses on a brokering of trusted autonomous military systems and associated technology, among other issues. She is the editor of the University of Queensland's Law and the Future of War podcast, where she interviews experts across the fields of law and emerging and disruptive technology, military strategy, and military affairs. Before returning to the University of Queensland, she spent 20 years as an Australian Army signals and legal officer. We also have with us a colleague many of you know, Dr. Kabir Adamu, who is the managing director of Beacon Security and Intelligence Limited, a renowned Abuja-based firm that specializes in providing comprehensive security risk management and intelligence solutions in Nigeria and the Sahel. He possesses a PhD in risk management and is a distinguished expert in enterprise security risk management and intelligence and national security. He also, I believe, has the honor of being an Africa Center for Strategic Studies alumni. We always are happy to welcome them back as speakers to our events. So welcome, the both of you. We are absolutely delighted to have the two of you with us today. And Dr. Sanders, we're gonna start with you on the typology question. The deployment of AI systems, particularly as it concerns military intelligence, targeting, and weapon systems, carries with it some operational risks of a pretty technical nature. Some of these, such as poorly trained or what they say as biased data that does not necessarily resemble the exact problem you want a large language model to solve, or an inability of the AI systems to explain their reasoning, we've already mentioned in passing. But I'd like to get a little deeper. Could you provide us with a typology summarizing some of the main operational risks that stem from the use of AI in the military?
Well, I'd like to start by just saying thank you very much for having me. Good morning and good day to everyone online. It's evening for me in Australia, so apologies if I look probably more tired than you all who've just woken up for the day. I also just want to clarify as well that as I am I'm back full time actually with the Australian Defence Force, that none of the comments that I'm making today represent those of the Australian government or the Australian Defence Force, but of course they will reflect my experience as an Australian given my location, and that's where the majority of my research work with experts in AI and its use in the military has occurred. So just important to get that out the way first. But I think the question you ask in relation to identifying one typology of risk with AI is probably an impossible one, because I think, as we've mentioned, artificial intelligence is ubiquitous in the way it could be incorporated into military use. So there are multiple different levels, I think, of assessing where the risks in relation to use of AI in the military context might come from. And the four main areas I think that are useful to frame where those risk considerations come into account is the context of use, the components of the system design, and then the features as to what the system is expected to do in its performance. And I've got a few slides that I'll just quickly share because I think it helps us understand those particular issues. I want to start by mentioning the context of use is probably important in terms of where operational risk may present itself. And tied to that also is that, from my perspective, is what is quite important is the legal regime that applies in the context of use. So in the military context in particular, from a use of force perspective, I'm concerned as a military lawyer as to whether we're in a situation of armed conflict or if we're in a situation of domestic law enforcement, because the risks in relation to compliance are going to change depending on which regime it is that we're actually applying. So, of course, above the threshold of conflict, when we are in situations of armed conflict, the laws of armed conflict or international humanitarian law applies, and the extent to which compliance with other legal rights like international human rights law is going to change. Whereas if we're in peacekeeping operations or occupation circumstances or domestic law enforcement, or in that grey area where we're in competition in the prelude to conflict, or post-conflict and back into that domestic law enforcement context, those risks are going to be different, particularly when we're talking about what rights individuals have when we're using AI and impinging upon those rights. So privacy is a really obvious one in terms of the extent to which individuals can expect privacy to be complied with the use of these systems, in terms of their data being collected, processed and used to make decisions with or without their consent. Very different laws in relation to how privacy might apply when we're in domestic law enforcement versus when we might be in a situation of high-end conflict. The other issue that I think is also important is to think about what kind of AI we're using and what components of that system are in force at the time, because we can't really just think about operational risks as if AI is just a similar kind of technology that is a tack on in relation to how it's used. And critically, the human-machine interface and the way that different kinds of AIs will have different risks as well, whether we're talking about large language models or different kinds of neural networks, but the way that AI integrates into the system is also going to carry different kinds of risks. And it may be that plugging AI into a particular part of a system doesn't actually bring with it any kind of operational risk for use in a military context. Or it may be that it's the outcomes and the outputs of that system are so heavily reliant upon that AI that we do need to invest more time in understanding how it is going to impact the rest of the system. And some very unique outputs in relation to what we're asking from the system in the military context as well are particularly evident when we're thinking about the higher risk uses of AI, things like use of force. So if we are thinking about lethal autonomous weapons, as compared to the use of AI to assist in logistic calculation outputs, for example. The third part, I think, is also thinking about the system as a design overall. I'm not going to explain this image here, but this is in detail. But this is what the Australian government represented to the group of government expert on lethal autonomous weapon systems under the auspices of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons. And I'm sorry, that's a mouthful, which are the international discussions about whether we need more international law to regulate the use of lethal autonomous weapon systems. And what this represents is effectively a design approach, a systems approach as to how Australia says it controls its use of force by the government. And this applies to every use of force in an armed conflict context, not just in relation to artificial intelligence. But what it does allow is for people who are designing, incorporating, or using systems in the military context to focus in to identify where those risks might manifest in the use of those particular systems. And the final issue in relation to risk is what is it that we're expecting of the system in the first place? Now, there's been a plethora of different kinds of principles and military principles lists that have come from states describing what they expect of the performance of AI systems in the military domain. And one of the common principles that people come back to is this term responsible. But across most states, there is no consistency in how people are explaining or identifying what the expectations of the performance of the system is, other than that there are a grab bag of features and values and characteristics that we see in what states are expecting the performance of AI to be. So to meet those expectations, there is obviously risks in the way that the system can be designed, developed, and complying with those. And you can see the kind of language used, things like reliability, accountability, explainability, all of those issues which are assuring against particular kinds of operational risk. So a long-winded answer, but to say that there is no one typology, and I think you have to consider across these very many different contexts, frameworks, and systems, how that particular AI is going to be used, and from that process, and what it is that you want from that AI in its use to be able to then identify where those risks might manifest.
Thanks. No, that's a really brilliant answer. I think essentially kind of taken the question and gone up one level of aggregation and come up with what I would say is it's a pretty comprehensive framework for thinking about what some of the main risks of AI are for consideration for military purposes. And because we like 8 alliterations here, I would sort of call them maybe the 3 or 4 C's. You talked about context, the context in which AI is being used, the components, precisely to what extent AI is or isn't being integrated into a particular system or network, which is, I think, also critically important. Control, thinking about how much actual kind of human control there is over an AI system. And then, for lack of a better term, because we like alliterations here, I'll call kind of the last one characteristics, which is, I think, what exactly the user wants to get out of AI system or network. I think that's a really great kind of simple, excellent kind of topology. And one area, so to get a little bit more concrete and specific, and I think speaking more kind of directly to your expertise, AI doesn't just kind of pose operational risks. There are also very extensive legal risks. I think these have received somewhat the most attention in kind of especially international circles about the usage of AI in the military domain. I think some of it has to do with the fact that there is really kind of deep concern over the degree to which human beings can or should have control over what seems to be increasingly autonomous decision-making technology. I think other concerns stem from, especially in armed conflict situations, the degree to which AI systems should, or can be made to comply with well-established laws of armed conflict. So what are the main legal risks stemming from the use of artificial intelligence?
Also another short question that has a really long and complicated answer to it. But I think we won't talk about law and ethics, but it's probably useful to think about what legal risk actually is in the first place. And really how it's mitigated then in process. So when we're talking about legal risks, we're talking about compliance with either the existing legal framework or what we think the future legal framework is going to look like. And as you've mentioned, most of the discussion and debate has been about the use of lethal autonomous weapon systems or incorporating AI like in decision support systems for those decisions that result in the use of force and the loss of life. So the CCW discussions has been one of the main forums in which these discussions have taken place, trying to articulate what these main risks have looked like. But the existing laws of war have a couple of approaches to try and address how to assess risk in relation to, or legal risk in particular, in relation to new technologies. So for those states that are members of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions, Article 36 in particular provides an obligation for states who are studying, developing, acquiring, or adopting these new weapons to assess compliance with existing international law for incorporating any of those systems into their military arsenals. And the way that that's been done in the past is essentially assessing how it is that that particular weapon system, when it's being used by a human, is then going to comply with the legal obligations that international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, impose. So there is effectively a presumption of lawful use in respect of the fact that the individual who's using the system is presumed to be under the control and coordination of the state. If they're not, then there's a process to deal with that human in terms of criminal responsibility and accountability. But in terms of artificial intelligence, the issue then becomes which components of the system are actually going to be undertaking those functions that the human had previously been doing. So where is it that that presumption of lawful use is no longer relevant to our consideration of the lawfulness of use of these kinds of systems? And it might be useful just to think about that in terms of three of the really basic laws of armed conflict and rules that are customary international law. So they are rules that, even though they are articulated in Additional Protocol 1, which not every state has signed up to, they are representative of customary international law, which means that all states are obliged to comply with these principles during the conduct of hostilities. And that is thinking about distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack. So we're really talking here about the use of force and whether or not an AI system could comply with those rules when they're actually being used. And distinction itself is the principle of identifying whether something is a military objective or not, so whether or not it can be directly targeted. So the use of AI systems, and we've seen a little bit of this in some decision support system use, integrated into the broader military system, presents legal risk in terms of its capacity to be able to meet the standard required by law to actually identify whether the thing being targeted or the person being targeted is going to meet that legal standard of distinction. And you mentioned in the introduction issues of pixelation and problems in relation to that. So in relation to proportionality, things get a little bit more complex, and there is quite a lot of debate and discussion as to whether or not AI is capable in its current technological state of being able to undertake this kind of an assessment. And the majority of discussion as to whether or not a system in and of itself could make a decision to use force in a proportionate way really is suggesting that a computer, an algorithm or whatever the artificial intelligence component of the system is that's entrusted with this decision-making process is capable of producing a result that is context specific and capable of weighing effectively two dissimilar considerations to produce a result that complies with the law. So the law effectively says in this context that there is an obligation upon the person who's deciding upon the attack. So that's usually shorthanded to the commander who's authorizing the attack, is ensuring that the harm that is expected or anticipated, which is sometimes shorthanded to collateral damage when we're talking about military parlance. So the collateral damage that is anticipated as a result of a strike or an attack is not excessive in relation to the direct and concrete military advantage that is anticipated at the time. And the majority of this principle is tied to the military art in terms of commanders judging what is appropriate in the circumstances and context. And the law actually requires that this is a contemporaneous decision. So there's also questions as to how effective AI can make that kind of decision if it is programmed in advance, and how tightly bound the framework and guardrails for AI decision making are, and how far in advance you could actually program a system to make a decision that would be lawfully proportionate. And then the last one is in relation to precautions in attack, which is talking about how it is you can take constant care to protect civilian populations and do everything feasible, which is the legal standard, to protect individuals from incidental harm in undertaking a military strike or an attack. And again, context and time specific, and also including a large list of considerations as to how that standard can be applied, including the requirement to do everything feasible. So again, the question is something that has been pre-programmed and set to undertake a particular kind of action capable of implementing feasible precautions at that point of use of force, or is there an ability to actually incorporate a large list of these precautions in a more general way? So that's probably the three most relevant considerations if we're thinking about the use of force. So if we're thinking about decision support system and lethal autonomous weapon systems, where it's probably the most acute kind of a risk to legal compliance.
Thank you very, very much. I think one thing you've highlighted for me is kind of how these risks become more acute the more advanced that AI becomes. I mean, the AI systems most commonly being used, for example, are like pattern image recognition systems that do things like, are able to automatically identify potentially something that looks like a tank or somebody carrying a weapon. And, that's different, but not all all that different from like existing systems we use to, for example, to like hone on radar emissions or things like that. But when we're talking about kind of really making these complicated distinctions between what constitutes proportionality, how much kind of civilian harm are you willing to countenance, that to me seems like kind of an order level of magnitude more complexity, and where really kind of tricky, thorny legal questions you've highlighted come in. So thanks for these very insightful remarks. You've given us a lot to worry about. I guess the final question for you, and given, how can some of the main risks you've identified be mitigated? And I think what you've done is you've laid out kind of really great typologies. You've highlighted that there are quite a number of risks, probably dozens, if not hundreds. So if you could just identify maybe some of the most important ones, maybe some ones you've talked about with respect to, like, for example, autonomous weapon decision making or things like that. How do you think they can best be mitigated?
Well, I think responsible design and assessment of compliance with the law across the capability lifecycle is probably the best way to achieve an assessment of compliance with artificial intelligence enabled capabilities in defense. So capability lifecycle being, well, the ICRC likes to call it the death cycle, but the capability lifecycle describing the acquisition process of identifying military capabilities from design through inception, through testing and evaluation, through incorporation into service, use and training by military forces, and then deployment in a military operational context. And across that capability lifecycle, there are certain levers that can be applied to try and reduce risk in relation to the adoption of these systems, and not necessarily just reduce risk, but actually understand risk better, or understand when those systems aren't capable of being used in a legally compliant way. So something that most security sector officials and military personnel are comfortable with is the idea of creating SOPs and TTPs for uses of systems and the implementation of rules of engagement. So thinking really carefully about what specific kinds of rules of engagement, SOPs and TTPs are necessary when we are incorporating AI into particular capabilities. So in the context of a lethal autonomous weapon system, for example, thinking about the ROE providing geographic limitations as to what kinds of environments that lethal autonomous weapon system could be used in. It may be that it's very capable of being used in a maritime environment because it's capable of responding to radar pings, and it's only going to be it's a decluttered environment. There's sufficient control of that environment to know that the thing that is going to be struck in response, if it's more likely to be defensive, is then going to be a safe target. Whereas if you're applying that same technology in an urban environment, the signal gets a lot more cluttered and a lot more noisy, and you don't have that same level of surety in relation to what that capability might be responding to. So across that capability lifecycle, there are certain levers you can adjust, provided you've taken the time to understand how that system is going to be incorporated into use. Coming back to this, this method of regulating risk from the Australian perspective, this is a way of understanding the control of systems in the use of force. And across those individual steps, it provides a way to build and understand what levers you might be wanting to put into the system to actually control some of those operational risks. And I won't go into that one in any detail because it's a horribly complex diagram, and I appreciate I've put that up for everyone, where it's got a lot of detail on the slide, but it is available for reading, publicly available, so I can provide that to everyone after this as well. The other thing that exists is there are a proliferation of toolkits and risk assessment models that exist in relation to the incorporation of AI into systems generally, but also in relation to the use of AI in defence. So there's a couple of Australian projects, and I'm just flashing one up here because I was heavily involved in it, which was talking about responsible autonomous systems and AI in the Australian context, and created a checklist that identifies key risk areas and then directs you to risk mitigation plans for each of those particular risk areas across the use of the actual system. It also tries to adopt some of these ethical concerns, which we heard in those characteristics, replete with words like responsible and those kinds of descriptors. There is ISO standards that talk about how you can design AI so it is ethical, and it provides also assurances and systems in relation to trying and identify those legal compliance points. So there are a whole heap of toolkits out there, but I think it is a case of using those toolkits and adopting them and integrating them into how it is the systems, the AI capabilities intended to be used within a broader system, rather than just focusing on that small AI component, which I think we're all easily distracted by because it is the new, the shiny, the novel, but we actually have to understand how it integrates in the broader system.
That was a masterful overview, and I think if there's one kind of takeaway I get, it's that it's not just enough to adopt a particular AI system. You have to really understand and think carefully about how and under what context you're going to use it. I think that's going to be particularly important for a lot of our African government and security sector colleagues who have joined us today, who might be getting a system that was designed outside of Africa, but are trying to adapt it to their own local circumstances. I think the message I get is just adoption is not enough. You have to really, really think carefully, both at a strategic and operational level, how the system is going to be employed, and most importantly, as you said, how it integrates with other systems. This is something that we have talked about repeatedly in this webinar series, is it's not just the AI that is doing a lot of work when it comes to how data-driven systems are being deployed. There's all this infrastructure. There's all this data that underlies the model. It's sometimes, and it going back to kind of your original point, it's about the context, right? In some cases, you're going to have AI doing most of the work. In some cases, it's going to be very small components. You have to be very sensitive to those kinds of concerns. So I'd now like to bring in Dr. Adamu, who can help us, I think, give us a sense of what AI risk mitigation might look like in the context of Nigeria, Africa's largest country. And as a starting point, I think it would be helpful, Dr. Adamu, if you could start with us to help us understand how Nigeria is currently approaching artificial intelligence in the military. To what extent is Nigeria incorporating AI systems into its military and security forces?
Thank you very much, Nat. Let me start with the usual disclaimer. My views are totally mine. I'm not representing any arm of the Nigerian government, even though I was speaking about one of the most important arms, which is the military. I would also want to start by giving a broad overview of the peculiar nature of the Nigerian military. Unlike most militaries in the world, the Nigerian military has an additional responsibility, which is domestic law enforcement. At the moment, the Nigerian military is deployed in almost all the 36 states of the Nigerian Federation, involved in one or the other form of military operation to support the domestic agencies, law enforcement and other security agencies. And just to give more context to that, an example is oil theft. Nigeria has a challenge of oil theft. It's been hurting the economy. And so the military has been deployed to support the prevention of that oil theft, which is purely a domestic law enforcement activity. And coupled with the various challenges of the Nigerian military, including a deficiency in terms of equipment, it's over time, Nigeria has relied significantly on foreign importation of domestic weaponry. And unfortunately, because of that reliance, we have seen over time, in particular with the US, where there have been instances where laws, especially on human rights, were used to deny Nigeria the purchase of those weapons. And then in other times, it would be the delay in contracting. So what the Nigerian military has done is to evolve domestic production of weaponry. And speaking specifically on AI, what we've seen over the years is application of AI in a couple of areas. The most prominent is intelligence gathering and surveillance. So we've seen the acquisition of both local as well as purchase from foreign countries of AI-enabled weapons, especially drone unmanned aerial vehicles in the area of intelligence gathering, especially intelligence surveillance and reconnaissance purposes. There is evidence of that in the several operations that the Nigerian military is involved in at the moment. I think the most prominent one is Operation Hadinkai in the northeast of the country, where for more than a decade now, Nigeria has had a challenge of terrorist groups. The two prominent ones, all affiliated to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State, quite active in that region in the northeast of the country. So this weaponry, AI-enabled weaponry, has supported IRS capabilities. The second component is enhanced communication systems. This is also one challenge within the Nigerian military, and so AI has been adopted to support such systems. Then we've also seen evidence to indicate that AI has been adopted to improve efficiency of fire support, especially within the Navy as an example, where we've seen local technology being introduced to support fire systems within the Navy, as well as within the other arms of the military. And then we've also seen evidence of global navigation satellite systems being adopted to enhance combat efficiency of Nigerian military. And then the last component is naval applications, especially in improving decision-making, threat detection systems, as well as navigation. We've seen evidence of the adoption of AI systems within the Nigerian Navy for that. Now, over time, all of this have been supported by the involvement of structures within the Nigerian military. So different formations have been created, including the Space Command, including the Satellite System Command. But then I must also say that all of this is happening within the eco space of the Nigerian technology space, where on the one hand, you have non-military players, including, for instance, the Ministry of Communication, and then another agency of government called NIDA, that the military has depended on for the introduction of a policy for the adoption of AI. Now, that is still in process. It hasn't been completed, but there's a lot of hope and anticipation that that will be done this year. So in summary, the need for the adoption of AI, first as a force multiplier, and then secondly, to support the ongoing military operations that I've mentioned are mainly domestic, is quite high within the Nigerian military, but it is work in progress, and it is guided by a lot of the formations that are being created at the moment to ensure a lot of what my co-speaker has mentioned in terms of standardization, in terms of responsibility, in terms of ensuring that international human rights obligations are being met. Most of the formations have that within them.
No, thank you very, very much. There was a very rich presentation. I think you highlighted for me a couple of things. I think one, that Nigeria might be farther along than most other African countries and probably most external actors would think, and potentially adopting and incorporating AI into various forms of communication, fire support, threat detection. And it has to do with the fact that there is robust and growing kind of internal defense industry. And that's actually something I think that we're already seeing. Like, I know that Nigeria manufactures a lot of its own drones, for example, and we're going to, I think, continue seeing into the future, in part because a lot of defense technology is being acquired from the private sector. And so Nigeria has a robust and growing tech sector. We live in an age of open technological revolution where private sector technologies are increasingly being incorporated into military and security forces. So I think that could be perhaps the beginning of a broader global trend. I want to talk to you. So now that you've kind of laid out the ways in which Nigeria is either incorporating or thinking about incorporating AI into its military, what do you see as some of the major challenges, particularly as it relates to its military systems and decision-making processes?
Thank you, Nate. I hinted at some of them in my earlier remarks. So essentially, Nigeria depended at the initial stages on its international partners. And so we've seen a reluctance in supporting the involvement and the creation of a domestic and local capacity for AI adoption, one that would be consistent and that would take into consideration the local dynamics that involves that the Nigerian military, for instance, is involved in. And like I did mention, what Nigeria did is to now move from that dependence on, say, international partners. And that's not to say that Nigeria hasn't purchased, especially drone unmanned aerial vehicles with AI capabilities from different countries. Evidence abound from Israel, from China, from Turkey, and several others. So that has happened. But then the homegrown technology that we're seeing has now encountered several challenges. One is the ecospace within which that technology exists. Nigeria still has, I would say, a very low internet density, as it were. And of course, that has also affected the military, the capacity, the structure, superstructure upon which any AI-enabled equipment is going to rely upon is that ecospace. And because the Nigerian ecospace is rudimentary, that challenge is also affecting the military. Number two is the technical capacity within the military itself to support especially research and into AI capabilities. I think there is a deficit of that technical capacity that is being taken care of at the moment, because I think there is an intentional incentivization for the acquisition of that type of capability within the Nigerian military. The third point is the age-old challenge of lack of coordination within the Nigerian security sector, where, for instance, a significant element within the military do not see non-military support capabilities as one that they can embrace. So there is that territory, that love of kind of taking care, holding on to their territory, and not kind of bringing in, especially industrial sector support from private sector players to play a role in that regard. There is a significant change in that. We're seeing, especially the current leadership within the Nigerian military, where they do understand the need for allowing private sector players into the field to support especially the involvement of capability in that regard. And then lastly, with the lack of a strategic, I would say, doctrine to determine the direction for AI integration into the Nigerian military. Almost all the strategic documents that are available, including, for instance, the National Defense Policy, the National Security Strategy, the various military doctrines in both the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, do not have specific components for AI integration. I think that is changing. There is current discussion on the review and the upgrading of these documents. So we're hoping to see that once that review is done, components of AI integration within the military.
Thank you very, very much. A really, really interesting, comprehensive answer. So final question, and I encourage folks, if they do have Q&A questions, to begin to populate them as part of the chat as we turn to our Q&A portion. But I want to kind of come back to this question of autonomy and decision-making autonomy that we talked a little bit about with Lauren. I think one concern I have is sort of that the more we become reliant on computers or artificial intelligence systems to do our thinking for us, or in the case of drones, to actually kind of do the attacking for us, the more you can to some extent divorce human beings who are making the decisions from the consequences of their actions, and even understanding exactly of how a particular strike or whatever is impacting the local political economy of an area where you are operating in. I think to some extent this is why we've seen, frankly, unmanned systems as catalytic if they've been in at times kind of shifting territories in conventional conflict, frankly struggle at times in guerrilla wars. I think kind of Nigeria's experience to some extent reflects that. So I think, you know, this is I think an issue that Nigeria has a lot of experience with, given how long it's been engaged in how long it's been engaged in domestic law enforcement, as you said it at the beginning, and its increasing reliance on more autonomous forms of weaponry such as drones. So to what extent is kind of the Nigerian government considering this? To what extent are measures being adopted to maybe mitigate some of these risks that come with a reliance on increasingly autonomous forms of weapon, or increasingly kind of weapons that are not make the security forces not quite necessarily as close to the population?
Thank you, Nat. So over the last, say, 6-7 years, from 2019 till date, in the company that I head, we've documented 18 incidents of inadvertent attacks on civilians by what we believe are drones, even though the reports of those incidents have not been made public. But the little that we've been able to gather from open sources suggests that drones were used in those particular attacks. Some of them are extremely horrific. One example is the one that happened in a village called Tudunbiri in Igabi local government in Kaduna State, northwestern Nigeria, where a huge civilian target was bombed, and at the end of the day, over 100 civilian casualties were recorded. There's another one also in the north central, where a group of ethnic Fulani were being moved from another state to another state, and then what appeared to be a drone targeted them. And at the end of the day, several of them, I think about 40 or thereabout, were killed in that particular incident. So like I said, we've documented 18 of such incidents across 7 states. And the total number of fatalities is over 400. And so the point I'm trying to bring out is that there is enormous pressure on the Nigerian military to ensure that these types of incidents where civilians are targeted in this law enforcement component of the Nigerian military's operation is avoided. In all of these incidents, there was significant backlash, and in some instances, even threat of legal action against the military and, of course, against the Nigerian government. We haven't seen much of that. From the civil society side, we've seen a lot of pressure on the Nigerian military. So the result of that is, I would say, several changes within the structure of the Nigerian military. They've created units to ensure, for instance, compliance with international human rights laws. They've also reduced, and this is again based on open source information, the reliance on autonomous weapons. So the last kind of decision is usually taken by a human being. But then the challenge, for instance, is which my co-speaker did mention too, is data that is used to take that decision is usually gathered by AI-enabled equipment. And if, for instance, the data was wrong in one way or the other, then the likelihood of the decision to be taken by that individual is also likely to be wrong. And we've seen instances of that in some of these 18 incidents that I've mentioned. So it is work in progress. This responsibility component, as it were, for managing the risk of the adoption of AI-enabled equipment in Nigeria. But suffice to say that there is huge realization. The pressure is enormous to ensure that these types of incidents don't repeat themselves. And I'm sure as we progress in the adoption of AI-enabled equipment, both locally sourced and then, of course, internationally sourced. We would see more of work in that direction, both in terms of structures that are created within the Nigerian military, and then, of course, in terms of the application of those weapons in domestic operations of the type that the Nigerian military is involved in at the moment.
Thank you very, very much. Excellent answer. So now we're going to begin the question and answer period. One is often we tend to focus on the dangers of AI, especially in use by security. Would either of you kind of speak to the advantages and opportunities? Second, we have a question in French, and I'm going to actually, because I don't think we have any French speakers in this webinar, so I'm actually going to ask the question in French, and then I'll translate it in English as well. But I want to get some French language speakers some French to listen to. So, bonjour depuis la Côte d'Ivoire. Dans le domaine de la défense, de nombreux pays comme la nôtre sont davantage d'utilisateurs que concepteurs des systèmes d'intelligence artificielle développés par des puissances étrangères. Quels sont les principaux enjeux et risques liés à cette dépendance technologique et quelles précautions nos États devraient-ils prendre pour garantir la souveraineté et leur sécurité? So I think this is an important question. Again, as you mentioned, Dr. Adamu, Nigeria gets a lot of its AI equipment, some of which has AI systems baked inside, often like drones, which use AI-enabled navigation. Sometimes they use AI-enabled software to kind of recognize or identify targets. Those may have risks, as you said, they're trained in one context, but might not be suitable for another context. How do you think about limiting those risks? I'd also be very curious for your answer, Dr. Sanders, as well as I would imagine that at least some of the AI systems that the Australian military uses are also not necessarily developed in Australia. So, Lauren, why don't we start with you, then we'll go to Kabir.
Thank you. So in relation to the first question, advantages and opportunities, I think there are absolutely a large number of advantages in using AI-enabled technologies, provided they have those guardrails around them to mitigate the legal, moral, and ethical risks of their use. And I think when we have seen failures in use of these systems, it's been in the way that they've been incorporated into the broader system in the use of force, or in the system of how it's being adopted for control. So thinking about the ability to analyze large amounts of data in short periods of time, if we're thinking about a really kinetic battle space, and if we're thinking about conducting targeting operations, the use of AI to keep track of civilian patterns of life is a really critical function that it could provide that hasn't traditionally been done very well in previous conflicts, or in most conflicts, in fact. You can look at some of the civilian casualty reports that came out of the ISIS conflict in Iraq, where a lot of the issues that were attributable to civilian casualty incidents were tied to the inability to track over a period of time with limited ISR capabilities the civilian pattern of life. So if you have the small, the many, the capable AI systems that are out there keeping an eye on the city with many straws, instead of just having one, exquisite ISR capability looking at the city with one straw, you have that capacity to track civilian populations much better, which of course assists in mitigating harm when you're using force. So I think there's absolutely advantages to using it. In relation to the question about the use of foreign AI systems by a state, I think that the Article 36 weapon review that I touched on, a lot of my work, my research and interdisciplinary work is in identifying how you can conduct a review of an AI system to have it comply with international legal obligations. It's a process that not very many states actually undertake, but it is one that is a useful systems approach and a legal requirement for those states that are additional Protocol 1 parties in relation to any capability that they are adopting, whether it's their own design or one that they're buying in. So the process is a legal obligation, and there's different ways that you can actually step through the process to assess whether the AI will comply with your legal obligations at international law, a lot of which also includes assessments as to how domestic law might work. So we've done quite a few international workshops as to how states are doing that. And there are a number of different approaches and public policies available as to how states have operationalized that legal obligation to assess compliance with the law for those AI systems, which I think is a really good indication of the way you could approach assessment of compliance with foreign capabilities.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Adamu.
Yeah, thank you. Starting with the first question, especially for a country like Nigeria, and I guess most of countries in Africa where security has remained a huge challenge, AI can be a force multiplier in different ways. It can also enhance the capabilities of law enforcement agencies let's use data gathering as an example, and data analytics. Where, for instance, the intelligence component of most of the law enforcement and security or even defense organizations can be supported with the data analytics that AI, as an example, can enable. Aside from that, counterterrorism efforts, different applications of counterterrorism. As an example, when I picked the Nigerian national security strategy and, of course, the national counterterrorism strategy, the various ways in which AI can support that, especially when you look at strategic communication as an example, AI can enable and support those components in a manner that would be more effective and efficient than it is at the moment. Peace building and conflict resolution components of most strategies, either security strategy or peace building strategy, can also be supported by AI. So it's not just the offensive component, which of course we've spoken about earlier on in the webinar. There are also several other components in terms of intelligence gathering, in terms of peace building, that AI applications can support both security and defense organizations. With the second question with regards to dependence on foreign equipment, it is a huge challenge, and given the ecospace within which this equipment will be deployed, no matter how effective, and I know Dr. Sanders has spoken about that, even if, for instance, we take measures to ensure the effectiveness of this equipment, if they are being deployed in ecospaces that do not have the capabilities to reduce the risk that we've identified earlier on, then the likelihood of the occurrences of those risks are extremely high. And I think this is what we've seen in several countries. So I think the challenge or the recommendation would be to focus on developing structures that would understand and mitigate, manage those risks, as well as, of course, encouraging the development of local capacity for the deployment of those equipment. And I think what we've seen in Nigeria at the moment is unfortunately a rush to acquire those equipment without necessarily investing in the development of the infrastructure. And I think this is something I've also seen across several African countries. So one good way to mitigate it, I would say, is focus on the development of the infrastructure for the deployment of such AI-enabled equipment.
Great. So we have quite a number of questions coming in now. I'll try to ask three of them and direct them to the two of you. So a couple of questions concerning to what extent it is even possible or practical to mitigate some types of AI risks. So I guess I'll kind of reframe it a little bit and to both of you, are there any particular types of AI risks that concern you or that strike you as particularly difficult to mitigate? One question sort of asked about, how do you prevent adversarial attacks or hacking of AI-powered weapons? Another I think risk that is increasingly of concern to a lot of analysts is AI that in some ways is inherently deceptive. That is, I think, particularly true with systems like generative AI. Are there any ways to kind of mitigate some of these risks, or is it just a really, really difficult kind of wicked problem? We have another couple of questions, and I'll direct these to you, Dr. Adamu, that are specifically about Nigeria, which are, to what extent are terrorist groups themselves in northeastern Nigeria making use of artificial intelligence, and what impact does this have on the Nigerian military? So, is this a case where because of the sophistication of the technology, that the military is a little bit ahead of the bad actors, or are bad actors kind of finding ways to exploit AI systems and how they're organizing themselves or conducting attacks or using it? And relatedly, if countries like Nigeria, and I think we definitely might see this trend going forward, where you have relatively large African countries with a pretty expansive tech ecosystem and a large private sector, increasingly becoming security exporters in various types of military and defense technology. So we have a question about this: is if we see this trend develop, kind of what kind of doctrine, strategy, or policies regarding military AI do you see Nigeria potentially promoting through its defense college systems or in its relationships with other countries around Africa? Final question, and I think this will go mostly to Dr. Sanders. You talked about the capability life cycle as stated by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Do you consider it a legal obligation? Do most AI-enabled weapons producers comply with this? And do they even have the capacity to do so? So we'll stop there. We'll come back to some of the other questions after our panelists have had a chance to answer. Let's start with you, Dr. Adamu, then we'll end with Dr. Sanders.
Okay, thank you, Nat. In terms of what worries me most in terms of the AI risk, I would say algorithmic bias and discrimination. And this is specific to Nigeria in particular. I don't know the experience in other parts of the world, but at the moment, we're dealing with framing and labeling of threat actors that is counterproductive. And so if this is, for instance, fed into a machine, the likelihood of wrong targeting or civilian targeting would be increased. And so we've seen, as an example, recent instances, and personally I've had reason to contact some, I would say, influential institutions across the world who produce global data on terrorism. They've, I don't know, inadvertently, I'll use that word, included an entire ethnic group that, at a very conservative estimate, represent about 5 million people. And then if you add their family members and the extended families, we're talking about 35 million that have been represented in those databases as terrorist, terror perpetrator groups. And so imagine a situation where this framing is kind of fed into a machine. And then, of course, the interpretation of that is, or the result of that is the targeting of anyone who is considered a member of that group. We're talking of between 5 million to 35 million persons. So that worries me a lot. And I think there is a need for better framing, for better terminologies that would be specific in terms of identifying those threat elements. With regards to whether non-state, especially ideological non-state armed groups in Nigeria have adopted AI technology, we haven't seen any evidence of that. And the two most prominent terror groups in Nigeria are affiliated to either Al-Qaeda, which is the Jamaat al-Ahlissunnah al-Dawatu wal-Jihad, otherwise called Boko Haram, or the Islamic State in West Africa province. There is no evidence to date to suggest that any of these groups have incorporated or adopted AI-enabled technology. We've seen of recent crewed, unmanned aerial vehicles with adapted sort of weapon systems, but there is no evidence to suggest that there is any AI capabilities enabled by any of these weapons. In the area of disinformation and propaganda, yes, where there may be evidence to suggest that these groups have, in one way or the other, even at the most rudimentary level, they are adopting the use of technology to enable that, and perhaps even with the support of some very hoary players within the international political scene. But then in terms of weaponization of any attack vector, we haven't seen the adoption of that. And then to the last question on whether Nigeria, given that it's currently adopting and developing local technology that are AI-enabled, would propagate that within maybe the sub-region and even internationally, yeah, it is very possible. Nigeria does have a very good footprint in several peacekeeping operations across the world. And where, for instance, technology can support that, especially AI-enabled technology, I see that as a possibility. Based on the policy statements that are being released from especially the leadership of the various military arms, starting from the Chief of Defense Staff to the various service chiefs, they have, in very clear terms, indicated that their adaptation and the adoption of technology is the way to go. And so I see that that perhaps in the near future, that would also be adopted in peacekeeping operations and the several other international operations that Nigeria is involved in. To also talk about the selling of equipment, the Nigerian domestic weapons production industry is growing, and of recent, starting from 2023 to now, we've seen interest in locally developed equipment. Some of them do have AI-enabled technology in them, and so that too, we may see the exportation of equipment to countries that not just in Africa, even in South America, we've seen interest in locally produced weaponry in Nigeria. So that too may be another area where maybe we may see the exportation of AI technology.
No, thank you very, very much. So one anecdote on that, not specific to Nigeria, but this is because I have I'm researching for another paper on this to give everyone a sense of how quickly I think this is shifting, especially when it comes to the exportation of autonomous systems and robotics. Is that about 5 years ago, there was a Tunisian robot that got a lot of attention during the COVID-19 pandemic for directing traffic. And now, learned this is publicly available information, Tunisia is exporting 50 of these robots to the United States, law enforcement. So we are really seeing, I think, the beginning of some pretty fundamental shifts in how in markets and exporters and production of certain types of defense technology, and especially kind of drones and robotics. And Nigeria is clearly, I think, a big actor in some of these emerging shifts. Dr. Sanders, over to you.
Thank you. I think just echoing what Dr. Adamu has said in relation to bias being a really big concern. I think the issue of early adoption of AI capabilities without sufficiently rigorous testing and evaluation for the context in which it's going to be used is what keeps me up at night. And I think the idea of using a system that was suitable for a particular context and adopting that in a different context, and then the mirroring effect of those biases across the system is quite concerning. I also think the use of some of these systems, because a lot of these systems are used as commercial off-the-shelf capabilities that are then translated in a really short period of time for completely unique capabilities. Your example of cross-border sale of robots is a great one, but the issue that always sticks in my mind is the Japanese croissant scanner. And it sounds really ridiculous to talk about an AI scanner that scans croissants on a tray in a Japanese bakery. It was within 12 months adopted and adapted to scan cancer cells in slides, biological slides, to assist in identification of cancer slides. And when you think about that, you can picture a tray of croissants going through a bakery to be able to be scanned and speed up the checkout system, and then thinking about how that's going to translate and the implications for using that same baseline technology for then identifying cancer in patients. Amazing we could adopt the technology that quickly, but that comes with a whole host of concerns about how the baseline technology is going to continue to be suited for that capability. And when we see the same kind of thing being adopted into military systems, not for croissants and cancer, but for for use of force or for decisions about depriving people of liberty or mentioning the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance uses, without doing that sufficiently rigorous testing and evaluation for the context, concerns me. And I think that's something that states have a significant role to play. And the question in relation to the ICRC's capability lifecycle comment, what I was actually talking about was the international legal obligation to review weapon systems for international law compliance. under Article 36 of Additional Protocol 1. It's a sensible, practical measure that is necessary to adopt systems by states that are legally compliant. It is a specific legal obligation for those states that are signatories to Additional Protocol 1. But it's not so much an obligation on the developers and designers of the system, it's the obligation of the state that is acquiring and then using the system. So it's the government's responsibility to create systems and demand from designers and developers in their country that they provide them sufficient information to help them conduct that testing and evaluation to their satisfaction. When they are going to use those capabilities, they comply with their legal obligations. And while that specific obligation is an international law one, it is one that can be translated to domestic law enforcement and peacekeeping contexts. So I think it's useful to identify how other states are undertaking those reviews and seeing how that can be adopted for those domestic uses in other contexts.
Thank you very much to you both. I think I see we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So I'm going to pose these questions to you, and then I ask each speaker to also include any kind of concluding or parting remarks you would like to give at the end of your response. So we have one question in the chat. Dr. Sanders, you'll feel free to comment, but I think this is probably a little bit more of a Dr. Adamu question than you about to what extent can or should regional actors be incorporating artificial intelligence into kind of shared systems. Like I know, for example, I think ECOWAS and the EU have been looking at early warning systems and networks that I think also to some extent rely on AI. So to what extent are there maybe opportunities for regional information or intelligence sharing platforms that are being driven by AI? And then sort of another, I think we'll end on a very difficult question, which is that how should governments try to deal with actors, be they criminal networks, terrorist groups, or in some cases, other governments that are not using AI responsibly, right? That are kind of disregarding the risks and seeking to create fully autonomous weapon systems without doing due diligence, creating bioweapons, things like that. Given the lack of consensus and the novelty of the technology, it seems almost inevitable that we're going to have to dealing with various bad actors who are not operating in good faith. So I think what should some of the consequences be? How do you think that's going to play out? Let's start with you, Dr. Sanders, and we'll end with Dr. Adamu.
Thank you. I think in relation to the question about non-compliance with the existing legal regime, I mean, there has been a lot of discussion as to whether the existing law satisfactorily covers the field in relation to use of AI in domestic law enforcement settings as well as in international humanitarian law settings. But we do have a broad toolkit in relation to dealing with individuals who aren't complying with those laws, as in the same way as we would approach any other kind of technology. So I think in the same way that we tend to change AI and consider anything that has AI incorporated into it as being somehow fundamentally different from other problem sets, I think that we need to really look critically as to what is the feature of the use of AI that makes it different from how we would treat the circumstances if it was any other context. And we have very strict rules in relation to the laws of armed conflict that say if you conduct a strike and you cause excessive civilian harm, there is individual criminal responsibility and state responsibility can be leveled against those that aren't complying with those rules. So we still have to use the existing accountability and criminal levers to respond. And if we genuinely think there is a gap that is created by this novel technology, and I personally don't think there is from an accountability perspective, I think that there is a sufficient framework for us to identify where there are breaches to hold individuals to account. The question is more broad in relation to what we see in terms of systemic breaches of IHL and criminal conduct generally, to actually follow through with existing mechanisms to hold individuals to account for those breaches of the law. So I think short version of the answer is we have laws in place to deal with misconduct. So we need to not be distracted by the use of the AI in the system and hold those individuals to account for those breaches.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Adamu.
Yeah, and thank you. So the question regarding whether regional associations should adopt, AI-enabled capabilities, especially in the area of intelligence, as an example. Yes, definitely. I believe that in the case of Africa, as an example, the African Union has come up with a strategy on the adoption of AI. And I think this has kind of provided the basis for member countries to build upon. And so in that regard, I think it's a step ahead. The components of that strategy show security application in different areas. And so I think the onus now is how to support member states to develop their local capacity for, of course, earlier on I did speak about the infrastructure upon which AI would lie. I would always kind of go back because that's even more important than the equipment themselves. At the moment, we're not seeing much of that. One or two countries, if you like Rwanda as an example, South Africa, Ghana, are doing quite well in terms of the development of that infrastructure. But most other member states, including Nigeria, have a long way to go in that regard. Once that is done, I think getting the member states together to develop some form of capability in as an example, border management, which is a huge issue among most African countries due to the size of their borders, the weakness of institutions. I think these are areas that AI can definitely support in ensuring enhanced capacity and capability within African member states. So it is the way to go. It is a direction. And I think given the complexities of current global geopolitics, it is in the interest of especially the advanced countries that have better capabilities in this regard to support this growth within African countries. If Europe, as an example, sees migration as a challenge, but then cannot relate border management in African countries to that challenge that they have in Europe, and they are not willing, for instance, to support African countries to evolve ways of ensuring and enhancing border management capabilities, then no matter what they do back home, they're not going to solve that challenge. So I'm hoping that going forward, aside from the effort by regional bodies, apart from effort by member state countries of these regional bodies, we're going to see more international collaboration. Part of the discussion, and I know this was covered in the previous series before this, is this global divide, the North-South divide in terms of capabilities for AI adoption. And I think in the area of security, especially since we're discussing risks, this is one huge risk that would need to be addressed. Supporting technology transfer, supporting local capacity development, both in terms of training of individuals, in terms of the creation, the establishment of structures on ground within African countries, is one very good area to reduce that divide that, if not reduced at the moment, would eventually become a risk, in terms of both global security challenges that we're seeing at the moment.
So thank you very, very much to you both. That was a really excellent, enriching conversation. I learned a lot about some of the risks of artificial intelligence, some considerations that our African government and security officials ought to take into account in mitigating them. Kind of just to summarize, if I may, I think we have a very good framework for thinking very broadly about AI risks as they relate to security, and that is Dr. Sandage's framework of thinking about the context in which AI is used, be it active armed conflict or domestic law enforcement, be it in a peacekeeping operation. That, I think, is a kind of first starting point, is very, very important. Second, thinking about the components, thinking about the degree to which AI is involved in a particular military or security system. It could be something as simple as heat detection or kind of detecting fires like we do with satellite systems now, or it could be something as complicated as actually trying to inform decision making about whether to do a drone strike or something like that. And those also that's very, very important. Those are very different types of considerations. Third is thinking about control. right? To what extent do humans, or are humans going to be able to control what the AI is doing, how it's affecting a particular decision that is being made? I think that question is going to become more and more relevant the more and more sophisticated artificial intelligence gets. And then finally, thinking about, for lack of better terminology, the characteristics, what you're designing the AI to do. And kind of, if there's one takeaway I'd like everyone to get from this conversation, is it's not just about, as Dr. Adamu said, adopting the technology. It's really about doing your due diligence and thinking about how this technology is going to apply to your local context. I think the anecdote about using a system to detect croissants on a bakery line being used to identify cancer cells is a great one, because it shows how flexible and how general purpose AI is. And what that means is that there are a lot of potential applications, a lot of potential advantageous applications, but it also means you have to do your due diligence in thinking about how that might apply to a particular context in which you're using it, thinking about all the ways in which that system could be misapplied, be it through having poor data, having it be not transparent, simply not having it work, having life cycle types of concerns. And I think kind of the both of you kind of gave a good maybe playbook for a lot of African countries beginning to think about how to mitigate some of these risks. As Dr. Damu said, it starts with really, connectivity and education, right? A lot of African countries don't have a lot of internet connectivity, which means that they can't always employ AI systems to their maximum extent. And it requires educated people not just to be able to adopt the system kind of remote, you have to have people who are trained in machine learning, who are trained in neural networks, who have some understanding on a technical level of what the AI is doing so they can make effective strategy and policy. What's great is I think a lot of these courses you can take are to some extent available for free online. They're increasingly being incorporated into African educational systems and institutions, but nevertheless, that is an extremely important part of the process. Kind of third, it means, I think, from a more kind of letting the rubber hit the road kind of level, having strategies and operational policies that, like Australia does, that I think really extensively give guidelines for generally kind of beginning with the 4 C's, how you're going to use AI, down to a very operational and technical level that thinks about each system, each application, each concern. I think that is really, really important. Techniques, tactics, and procedures. And it requires, to conclude, as Dr. Adamu said, and I think the Nigerian military government's finding this out, it requires a little bit of a different way of thinking about how to procure, implement, and use AI systems. Contrary to popular belief, it's not all about how AI is affecting kind of weapon systems. A lot of AI applications are in logistics. A lot of military effectiveness isn't so much about using weapons. It's about getting logistics and operations right. And that means that, especially in today's world, having good partnerships with the private sector is really, really important. We live in an era where digitally, especially, and in AI as well, most of the innovation is happening in the private sector, which means that they're an absolutely essential partner when it thinks about how to taking what the private sector is doing and transferring it into for strategic and military purposes. And this opens up a lot of opportunities, especially when it comes to potentially thinking about how your countries can produce and use their own technology. But it always also carries with it a ton of risk. So those are some of my key takeaways. We will kind of endeavor to try to share some of the toolkits and slides that were shared in today's presentation with you as this video gets posted on the website. And for all those of you who are interested in Dr. Adamu's remarks about some of the regional and components of artificial intelligence, please stay tuned for tomorrow. That will be our final webinar of this series, where we're going to talk all about Africa's role in regional discussions, international debates about the use of AI, maybe thinking about how AI can be incorporated into Africa's regional institutions. We have 2 great speakers tomorrow. I hope to see you there. Until then, have a good day wherever you are.